It was no larger than a pencil, and it had no explosive charge. Milled from solid steel, it was weighted at the tip and finned at the back, a perfectly simple aerodynamic dart. It was designed to do one thing and one thing only. Dropped from a box 1,000 feet in the air, it would tumble for a moment before righting itself, pointing its needle-sharp tip towards the earth. As it accelerated, reaching terminal velocity, it became a silent, deadly projectile, one of hundreds, then thousands released at once. The sound they made falling from the sky was not a whistle or a scream, like an artillery shell, but a soft, humming hiss, like the tearing of silk. For the soldiers in the trenches below, this was often the only warning they received. A single dart could pierce a steel helmet, the wooden stock of a rifle, and the man holding it. But its true horror lay in its design. Upon impact, the weighted tip would cause the dart to tumble violently inside the human body. It didn't just pierce a man, it tore through him, shredding muscle, organs, and bone in a chaotic, unpredictable path. The entry wound would be a tiny, almost insignificant puncture. The exit wound, if there was one, would be a gaping, horrific crater. A man could be struck in the shoulder, and the flechette could exit through his hip. Medics of the era, accustomed to the grim but relatively straightforward geometry of a bullet wound, were utterly unprepared for this. The internal damage was so catastrophic, so complex, that the wounds were almost always fatal. Even if a man survived the initial impact, he would almost certainly die of internal bleeding or rampant infection in the mud-soaked field hospitals. This was the flechette, and it was one of the first weapons designed specifically for the new vertical battlefield of the Great War. To understand why such a deliberately vicious weapon was ever conceived, you have to understand the problem it was trying to solve. By late 1914, the Western Front had stagnated into a seemingly unbreakable stalemate. Millions of men were dug into a vast, complex network of trenches that stretched from the Swiss border to the North Sea. This was a new kind of war, a war of attrition where the primary tools were the machine gun, barbed wire, and artillery. It was a linear meat grinder. The challenge for military thinkers on both sides was how to break this deadlock. How do you attack an enemy who is dug into the very earth, protected by layers of mud, wood, and sandbags? The answer came from the sky. The airplane, a novelty just a few years earlier, was rapidly evolving into a machine of war. Early pilots would fly over enemy lines, sketching trench maps or, in a moment of personal bravado, taking potshots at each other with service revolvers. But soon, they began to experiment. They dropped makeshift bombs, heavy artillery shells with fins welded on. These were inaccurate and often just as dangerous to the pilot as they were to the enemy. What they needed was a weapon that could saturate an area, a weapon that could defeat the trench's primary advantage, its cover from horizontal fire. The trench protected you from bullets and shrapnel flying across the battlefield, but it left you terrifyingly exposed to anything coming straight down. The flechette was the brutally simple industrial age answer. French aviators were the first to deploy them in great numbers, packing hundreds into canisters that could be opened over a target. German pilots quickly followed suit, developing their own versions. For a time, it seemed like the perfect anti-personnel weapon for this new form of warfare. It was cheap to manufacture, required no complex explosives, and was terrifyingly effective. A single pilot could fly over a packed trench or a column of marching soldiers and unleash a silent steel rain, inflicting dozens of casualties in seconds without a single explosion. It was the cold, calculated logic of the abattoir applied from the air. This weapon, in all its grim efficiency, was a symptom of a much larger, more terrifying transformation. The First World War was not just a conflict of nations, it was a conflict between centuries. It began with tactics and a mindset forged in the age of Napoleon. Cavalry charges, infantry advancing in ordered lines, officers leading from the front with swords. It would end in the modern age, with tanks, chemical warfare, and anonymous industrialized slaughter. The flechette was a product of this violent transition. It took a medieval concept, the arrow, and mass-produced it, industrialized it, and turned it into something new and horrific. This was the defining characteristic of the war's new technologies. They weren't just more powerful versions of old weapons, they were fundamentally different in their nature, and their psychological impact. They were impersonal. A soldier in the 19th century could see the man he was fighting. A bayonet charge, however brutal, was an intensely personal act. Even a rifle bullet was fired by an individual at a target. But these new weapons divorced the act of killing from the killer. The artilleryman firing a shell from 10 miles away never saw the men he vaporized. The machine gunner didn't aim at one soldier, but sprayed a cone of fire into a crowd of them. And the pilot, a speck in the sky, simply pulled a lever, unleashing a storm of metal on figures so small they were barely human. This industrial detachment gave rise to an entire arsenal of cruelty. On April 22, 1915, near the Belgian city of Ypres, German troops opened the valves on thousands of cylinders, releasing a creeping greenish-yellow cloud of chlorine gas that drifted across no man's land. Allied soldiers, seeing the strange mist, were first curious, then terrified. The gas attacked the respiratory system, causing a man to suffocate, his lungs filling with fluid as he essentially drowned on dry land. Those who survived were often blinded or left with chronic, debilitating lung conditions. It was a weapon that didn't just kill you, it dissolved you from the inside out, and it was followed by even more horrific concoctions: phosgene, which was colorless and harder to detect, and the infamous mustard gas, an oily substance that caused horrific blisters on the skin, in the eyes, and throughout the respiratory tract, leading to a slow, agonizing death that could take weeks. At the same time, another ancient fear was weaponized: fire. German engineers developed the Flammenwerfer, the flamethrower. It was a cumbersome, terrifying device that could project a jet of burning oil over 100 feet. It was devastatingly effective at clearing out machine gun nests and bunkers, but its psychological effect was its greatest power. The sight of men running, screaming, their bodies engulfed in liquid fire was enough to break the morale of even the most hardened soldiers. It tapped into a primal terror, a horror that a bullet or a shell could never replicate. The flechette, the poison gas, the liquid fire, they were all born from the same cold calculus. The war had become a problem of engineering, and the human body was simply the material to be overcome. If a trench could stop a bullet, then the solution was to attack from above with a steel dart, or to fill that trench with a substance that made breathing lethal. The goal was no longer just to defeat an army, but to break its will to exist, to introduce a level of horror so profound that the human mind simply could not withstand it. This was total war, a war against the soldier's body, his mind, and his very soul. But a strange thing happened. In the decades that followed, as humanity tried to process the industrial-scale slaughter of the Great War, a consensus began to emerge. Some of these weapons, despite their effectiveness, were simply too cruel. A line had been crossed. While the world would go on to develop weapons of even greater destructive power, some of these specific tools of terror would be outlawed, condemned by international treaty as violations of the laws of war. The flechette, once the cutting edge of aerial warfare, would be largely abandoned, a footnote in the history of military technology. This raises a profound and disturbing question. In the brutal mathematics of war, how do we decide what is an acceptable way to kill and what is a war crime? Where is the line between a weapon of war and a weapon too cruel to use? The answer lies not in a single, simple rule, but in a complex and often contradictory set of principles that were forged in the aftermath of the Great War, principles that attempt to impose a sliver of humanity onto the inhumanity of combat. To understand how a weapon is judged, we must first understand the grim criteria used: distinction, proportionality, and the prohibition against superfluous injury or unnecessary suffering. These are the pillars of the modern laws of war, and almost all of the terrifying new weapons of the First World War would be weighed against them. The principle of distinction is the most straightforward. It demands that a weapon be capable of distinguishing between a legitimate military target, a soldier, a tank, a bunker, and a civilian, a school, or a hospital. It is the moral and legal obligation to aim. A rifle bullet is the quintessential example of a discriminate weapon. In the hands of a trained soldier, it can be directed at a specific enemy combatant. But consider a cloud of poison gas. Once released from its canisters, it is subject to the whims of the wind. It cannot be aimed. It flows into the lowest points of the landscape, the trenches, the craters, the cellars of nearby farmhouses. It does not distinguish between the soldier in his dugout and the child hiding in her home. It is, by its very nature, an indiscriminate killer, and for this reason alone, it fails the first and most fundamental test of a lawful weapon. But it is the principle of unnecessary suffering where the line becomes both most crucial and most blurry. The accepted brutal logic of war states that the goal is to incapacitate an enemy soldier, to remove them from the fight. A wound is a means to that end. But some weapons are designed not merely to incapacitate, but to do so in a way that inflicts horror and agony far beyond what is required for a military objective. They are designed to torture as much as to kill, and this is where we must look closely at the mechanics of these abandoned technologies. Let's return to the fléchette. On the surface, it seems simple enough. A small metal dart dropped from the sky. It seems no more cruel than a bullet, but its design reveals a more vicious intent. A bullet is engineered for aerodynamic stability. It is meant to fly point first and create a relatively clean, predictable wound channel. A fléchette was the opposite. It was a simple steel nail, often with fins stamped onto the back. Dropped by the thousand from canisters, these darts would shower down over a wide area. As they fell, they were unstable. They would tumble end over end. When one struck a human body, it didn't pierce cleanly. It tore, it ripped through flesh and muscle, creating a ragged, star-shaped wound. It would often bend or break apart on impact with bone, leaving behind shards of metal that were a surgeon's nightmare. The wounds were complex, difficult to clean, and almost guaranteed to become infected in the mud of the trenches. The military purpose was clear: to wound as many soldiers as possible in an open position, overwhelming their medical services and breaking their morale. But the method crossed a line. The suffering it caused was seen as superfluous. The design of the weapon maximized injury beyond the point of simply stopping a soldier. It was a tool engineered for butchery, and while it was never formally banned by a specific treaty in the same way as gas, its inherent cruelty and its replacement by more effective, if no less deadly, fragmentation bombs saw it quietly fall out of favor. It was a weapon whose viciousness outstripped its utility. Now compare that to poison gas, specifically mustard gas. This was the undisputed king of superfluous injury. Chlorine gas, the first to be used, killed by asphyxiation, drowning its victims as their lungs filled with fluid. Phosgene was more insidious, its effects delayed, killing men hours or days after they thought they had survived. But mustard gas was a different kind of evil. It wasn't even primarily a lethal agent. It was designed to maim and incapacitate on a mass scale. It was a vesicant, a blistering agent. Heavier than air, it would sink into the trenches and linger for days, poisoning the very ground itself. It attacked any moist part of the body. Contact with the skin raised horrific, agonizing blisters filled with yellow fluid, burns that were as painful as fire, but took weeks to heal. If inhaled, it burned the entire respiratory tract, from the sinuses to the deep tissues of the lungs, causing a slow, agonizing internal decay. But its most notorious effect was on the eyes. It caused acute conjunctivitis, swelling the eyelids shut and effectively blinding its victims. The image of long, shuffling lines of blinded soldiers, each with his hand on the shoulder of the man in front, became one of the most haunting and enduring symbols of the war's pointless cruelty. This was the definition of unnecessary suffering. The military objective was to deny ground to the enemy and take soldiers out of the fight. Mustard gas did this, but it did so by inflicting debilitating long-term injuries of a particularly sadistic nature. It didn't just kill. It left a generation of men scarred, blinded, and with lungs that would burn for the rest of their shortened lives. It was this weapon, more than any other, that seared itself onto the conscience of the world. In 1925, the nations of the world gathered to create the Geneva Protocol, a treaty explicitly banning the use of asphyxiating, poisonous, or other gases, and of all analogous liquids, materials, or devices in warfare. It was a direct and unequivocal response to the trenches. It was an international declaration that some methods of killing are so horrific, so indiscriminate, and so bent on inflicting suffering for its own sake, that they have no place in any civilized nation's arsenal. This then brings us to the paradox, the flamethrower. By any measure, death by liquid fire is one of the most terrifying fates imaginable. Why did this weapon survive the post-war cull when the fléchette and gas did not? The answer, again, lies in a cold, legalistic interpretation of those same principles. Unlike gas, a flamethrower is a direct-fire, line-of-sight weapon. In theory, you must see your target to use it. It can be aimed at a specific machine gun nest or a fortified bunker. It is not therefore inherently indiscriminate in the same way as a cloud of drifting gas. And while the suffering it causes is immense, a grim military argument is made that it is not superfluous. Its purpose is to neutralize a heavily defended position instantly and completely. The intense heat and the consumption of oxygen in an enclosed space is brutally effective at achieving this specific military end. The horror it causes is seen as a direct consequence of its function, not a separate, deliberately cruel design feature. The line is terrifyingly thin, and many would argue the flamethrower stands squarely on the wrong side of it. But in the eyes of military doctrine and international law, it has so far remained a legitimate weapon of war. The story of these weapons reveals that the laws of war are not a perfect moral code. They are a pragmatic, often uncomfortable negotiation between military necessity and human conscience. The line between an acceptable weapon and a war crime is not drawn in stone. It is drawn by us. It was drawn by the diplomats in Geneva, haunted by the images of blinded soldiers. It was drawn by military commanders who found that weapons like the fléchette created more horror than tactical advantage. It is a shifting line, constantly being redrawn as technology evolves. The silent steel dart of 1915 has been replaced by the debate over autonomous drones and cyber warfare. But the questions remain exactly the same. Does this weapon distinguish friend from foe, combatant from civilian? And does it inflict a level of suffering that serves no purpose other than cruelty itself? The weapons deemed too cruel for modern war serve as a permanent, chilling reminder that the capacity for invention can easily outpace the development of restraint, and that the most important question we can ask about any weapon is not, can we use it, but should we? But for the soldier in the mud, staring at the maw of a machine, gun nest, the philosophical debates of diplomats in Geneva are a world away. He is not concerned with the shifting lines of international law. He is concerned with the single, brutal line between his life and his death. And when a commander orders him to use a weapon, the question is no longer should we, but how? The abstract horror of a weapon's design becomes the immediate, tangible reality of its use. And it is here in the diaries, the letters home and the haunted memories of those who were there, that the true nature of these weapons is revealed. The flamethrower, known grimly by German troops as the Flammenwerfer, or by Allied soldiers as the Hellblaster or Satan's Wand, was a weapon that carried its own unique psychological burden. For the man tasked with operating it, he was not just a soldier, he was a marked man. Strapped to his back was a highly volatile combination of pressurized tanks filled with jellied gasoline or diesel. He was in effect a walking bomb, a single well-placed bullet, a stray piece of shrapnel, and his own weapon would become his funeral pyre. This constant intimate dance with self-immolation created a specific kind of soldier, one operating on a knife's edge of fatalism and focused aggression. One American Marine fighting on the island of Peleliu described the moment of ignition. It wasn't a trigger pull so much as unleashing a force of nature. First came the thump of the igniter, a sound he said you felt in your teeth. Then, a gut-shaking roar as the stream of liquid fire erupted from the nozzle. He wrote not of courage, but of a strange, terrifying sense of power. For a few brief seconds, you were a god of destruction, painting the world in a vibrant, terrible orange. You weren't shooting at men, you told yourself. You were servicing a target, neutralizing a pillbox, cleansing a cave. The language of the military was a deliberate, necessary shield against the reality of what you were doing, burning men alive. But the shield was never perfect. The smell always got through. A sickeningly sweet, acrid stench of fuel, scorched earth, and something else. Something ancient and primal that the mind refused to name, but the soul never forgot. The experience from the other side of the nozzle was the stuff of nightmares. To be the target of a flamethrower was to face a death that stripped away all semblance of a soldier's dignity. A letter found in the pocket of a German soldier in the Hürtgen forest describes the seconds before an attack. He writes of the relative quiet between machine gun bursts, the smell of damp earth and pine. Then, a new sound. Not the crack of a rifle or the crump of a mortar, but a wet, hungry roar that seemed to suck the air right out of the world. He saw a jet of what looked like dark water shoot past the bunker's aperture, and for a split second, he was confused. Then, it ignited. The world vanished, replaced by a solid wall of fire. It wasn't just the heat, he tried to explain. It was the pressure, the sheer force of it. The flame was a living thing, a predator that clawed its way into the tiny space, devouring oxygen, turning the air into poison. The screams of his comrades were snuffed out almost instantly, not by the fire itself, but by the sudden, complete absence of anything to breathe. His last scrawled words were, "The air is fire, we are drowning in hell." But if the flamethrower represented a personal, targeted form of hell, then the introduction of poison gas in the First World War represented an indiscriminate atmospheric one. It was a weapon that attacked not just the soldier, but the very environment he needed to survive. It turned the air itself into the enemy. The first large-scale use of chlorine gas at Ypres in 1915 was a moment that changed the face of warfare forever. It wasn't just a new weapon, it was a new kind of fear. A British soldier's diary from that front describes a quiet April afternoon. The birds were singing. A pale sun was out. Then, without warning, they saw it. A strange, rolling cloud of greenish-yellow mist, about the height of a man, drifting slowly towards them on a gentle breeze. It didn't roar like an artillery shell, it hissed, a faint, sibilant sound from thousands of canisters being opened in the German trenches. At first, there was confusion. Then, curiosity. Then the smell hit them, a sharp metallic scent like pineapple and pepper or bleach. And then the panic began. The cloud enveloped them and men began to gasp, to clutch at their throats, their eyes streaming. Chlorine gas, when inhaled, combines with the moisture in the lungs to form hydrochloric acid. It dissolves the delicate tissues from the inside out. Men were literally drowning in their own bodily fluids, coughing up a frothy green liquid, their faces turning blue as they suffocated under an open sky. The fear it created was unlike anything else. You could hide from a bullet in a trench. You could take cover from a shell in a dugout. But how do you hide from the air itself? The gas masks that were hastily developed became a symbol of this new, terrifying war. They were claustrophobic, with fogged-up eyepieces and a suffocating rubber mouthpiece that made it almost impossible to breathe. Yet to take it off was certain death. A Canadian private wrote of the sheer terror of seeing a fellow soldier, his mask dislodged, clawing at his own throat, his eyes wide with a silent, pleading horror that would be seared into the private's memory for the rest of his life. Later came mustard gas, an even more insidious killer. It was an oily liquid that smelled faintly of garlic or mustard, and it didn't need to be inhaled. It settled on the ground, in the mud, on uniforms and equipment, and remained active for days, even weeks. It caused horrific weeping blisters on any patch of exposed skin, but its worst effects were on the eyes, burning the corneas and causing temporary or permanent blindness. Thousands of men were left stumbling back from the lines, their hands on the shoulder of the man in front. In long, tragic gas parades, their lives not ended, but irrevocably shattered. They had not been killed, but their world had been plunged into darkness, the last thing they ever saw being the yellow-brown haze of a chemical weapon. These were the weapons that left a different kind of scar. They didn't just break bodies, they broke minds. They introduced a level of suffering that seemed to serve no military purpose beyond pure, unadulterated terror. The flamethrower operator was haunted by the smells and the unseen screams from the pillbox. The gas survivor was haunted by the memory of the hiss, the choking of his friends, the claustrophobic panic of his own mask. These weapons blurred the line between killing an enemy and torturing a human being. They stripped away the fiction of a noble fight, of a clean kill, and exposed the raw, ugly truth of what happens when human ingenuity is dedicated solely to the task of inflicting pain. And for the men who wielded them and the men who faced them, the war would never ever be over. The Great War ended not with a bang but with a shattered, exhausted silence. The guns fell quiet, the trenches began to empty, and millions of men who had survived the unthinkable started the long journey home. But as they left the mud and the wire behind, they carried invisible wounds. The weapons of terror had left a scar not just on their bodies, but on the conscience of the 20th century. For the first time, the international community was forced to look at a weapon it had created and collectively recoil in horror. The machine gun was ruthlessly efficient, the artillery shell was devastatingly indiscriminate, but chemical warfare was seen as something else entirely. It was perceived as a profound moral transgression, a descent into a form of barbarism that even the industrial slaughter of the Western Front could not normalize. This wasn't just a sentiment held by civilians reading sanitized reports back home. It was felt deeply by the soldiers and the generals themselves. They had seen its effects up close. It was a weapon that did not respect the established rituals of combat. It poisoned the earth, drifted on the wind, and killed with a creeping, agonizing slowness. It was an attack not just on the soldier, but on the very air he needed to live. It felt like a betrayal of some unwritten rule, a foul pestilence that had no place on a battlefield. And so, in the aftermath of the war to end all wars, the world attempted an unprecedented act of self-restraint. In 1925, the nations of the world gathered to sign the Geneva Protocol. It was a simple yet monumental declaration, an agreement to prohibit the use of asphyxiating, poisonous, or other gases in warfare. It was a global admission that humanity had invented a tool too cruel for its own conflicts. But the protocol was a fragile thing, a gentleman's agreement signed in the shadow of a recent atrocity. It banned the use of these weapons, but crucially, not their creation, their stockpiling, or their improvement. The genie was out of the bottle, and no treaty could force it back inside. Throughout the 1920s and 30s, as the world drifted inexorably towards another global conflict, the chemical arsenals of the great powers did not shrink. They grew to an unimaginable scale. New, even more terrifying nerve agents like tabun and sarin were developed in secret laboratories. By 1939, every major combatant in the Second World War possessed colossal stockpiles of chemical weapons, enough to poison entire continents. The stage was set for a chemical apocalypse that would make the horrors of Ypres and the Somme look like a prelude. And yet it never happened. On the battlefields of Europe, from the beaches of Normandy to the ruins of Stalingrad, gas was almost never used. This wasn't because of a sudden surge of moral clarity. It was because of fear. The memory of the First World War had created a powerful new deterrent, the certainty of massive, horrifying retaliation. Adolf Hitler, who had been temporarily blinded by a British gas attack in 1918, knew their power intimately. His generals repeatedly urged him to deploy their new superior nerve agents, but he refused, convinced the Allies possessed equally horrific weapons and would unleash them on German cities without hesitation. A tense, silent standoff ensued. It was a form of mutually assured destruction, decades before the atomic bomb. The weapon had become so terrifying that its primary function was no longer to be used, but to prevent its own use by the other side. The taboo, however, was not absolute. It only held between powers who could strike back with equal force. Where there was an imbalance, where one side was technologically superior and its victim defenseless, the mask of civilization slipped. The Italians used mustard gas with brutal effectiveness against tribal warriors in Ethiopia. The Japanese Imperial Army deployed a sickening cocktail of chemical and biological agents against both soldiers and civilians in China, committing atrocities far from the eyes of the Western world. These horrific episodes proved a chilling truth. The line drawn at Geneva was not a moral boundary, but a strategic one. The weapon was still there, waiting, ready to be used on anyone who couldn't fight back. In the decades that followed, the shadow of chemical warfare loomed over the Cold War and beyond. It became the poor man's atomic bomb, a terrifyingly accessible weapon of mass destruction. We saw its chilling return in the Iran-Iraq War, and more recently in the horrific images from Syria, where civilians choked to death in their own homes, a scene torn directly from the nightmares of 1915. The ghost of Ypres still haunts us, a reminder that the knowledge of how to turn the air itself into a poison can never be unlearned. The ultimate legacy of these weapons, then, is a profound and disturbing paradox. They stand as a testament to the depths of human cruelty, to our terrifying ingenuity in the service of pain. But the sheer horror they represent also forced a moment of collective reflection. They forced humanity to draw a line, however faint and fragile, in the blood-soaked sand of war. The weapon that was designed for pure terror ultimately became its own deterrent. Its true power, its lasting impact on history, was not in the thousands it killed, but in the hundreds of millions it held hostage through fear. It is the weapon that sits in the arsenal, waiting. A silent promise of a suffering so profound that we dare not unleash it. A constant, chilling reminder that the greatest restraint we have ever shown was born from the greatest cruelty we ever inflicted.